So
You
Dan.
might be interested to know that 5 years of my early life were spent in the heart of the Adirondacks. From second grade through seventh grade, my family lived in Indian Lake.
Oh, wow.
So I was very interested when I saw this topic.
So Sawyer and Dan, welcome. Tell us about your organizations. Tell us about your work.
You want to go first, Sawyer, or do you want me to?
Dan, why don't you kick it off?
All right. I'll just start by kind of putting this whole thing in context. ADK Action and Sawyer is over on the east side of the park. ADK Action is a wonderful organization who I also happen to be a board member of. And she'll talk a little bit more about that, but their geographic focus is the entirety of the Adirondack Park for the most part. My day job is I work for LivingADK, which is a place-based geographic 501c3 that focuses mostly on kind of the west side of the park, where Oneida County meets Herkimer County meets western Hamilton County. And I'm sure you all have dealt with issues of geography when it comes to funding sources and identity, and when town boards and cities and counties and sort of these artificial lines that we put for ourselves kind of become problematic when you're trying to give social services and intervene on a grassroots level. So our organization tries to help bridge across those county divides when it comes to focuses like any community factors that about healthy communities, whether it's food access, broadband expansion, healthcare, you name it, we sort of dip our toe in the water. And I would say that we're not unlike a faith community in that we can be very flexible to the needs of the communities as they need it in the moment. When COVID happened, I know all of us sort of dropped everything and said, this is what we're working on now. And, at the moment, housing is sort of one of the center posts of the things that is kind of a root of a lot of our issues, as is food security and making sure that our folks are fed and healthy. So it's kind of a broad way of saying we're kind of a smaller component of ADK Action, sort of larger component, and we're very flexible within that space. So I'll toss it over to Sawyer and let her talk a little bit more about ADK Action.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you again for having me. Let me know if so sometimes that happens. But I'm the director of ADK Action, and as Dan mentioned, we work across the greater Adirondack region to try to bring a lot of what a community development organization does and a lot of what an environmental conservation organization does to help people and nature thrive together in the North Country. I think that's what the Adirondacks is really all about, and we want to make sure our communities can have a relationship to these wild places, but also have what they need. Like Dan mentioned, you need access to the internet, you need cell phone service, you need to be able to drive to the grocery store without spending half a day, and you want your communities to feel vibrant and to feel whole. So we're trying to take creative strategies on complex problems, and we work really closely with other nonprofits like LivingADK. We work a lot with the Osceola River Association, with our food hubs all over the park, and a whole bunch of other partners. But we have 7 active projects, one of which is food security, and the others revolve around the issues I mentioned. We also do some pollinator species conservation, and we dipped our toe into the housing space, trying to help some ideas around land banks take flight. And we positive results there about land banks emerging in the park now. But the real meat of our work right now, pun intended, is food security, and that's really exciting to us. So we can talk about a whole bunch of things. We can tell you more about that specific project where Dan and I are really working together, particularly in the Western Adirondacks. I think that might be the most interesting to you all. Dan also wears a couple of other hats that I don't want to stop him from talking about. So Dan, I'm going to bring it back to you.
Yeah. You're going to hear probably a lot of acronyms. We apologize ahead of time. Everything in the not-for-profit space, as you all know, is like acronyms. So if at any point there's something that you don't understand, just feel free to like yell at us because we're talking in code to one another. And I do think it's important that we sort of focus on the food access part of it, because as we know, food is cheap medicine. Food is inexpensive mental health. Food is a great way to build community. It is an integral part of our economic systems. It is, ways that we share our culture. And it's really just a holistic grassroots intervention that solves a lot of ails. So as we sort of pulled the threads on so many of these projects, a lot of it came back to keeping people happy, healthy, and safe. Has to do with the food that they're intaking. First off, do they have the calories that they need to survive? But then beyond that, can they be supporting local farms in that? Can they learn to provide for themselves in that? And are they taking in food that is healthy and nutritious and cooking for themselves and cooking for their neighbors and these types of things? So that's where a lot of the focus of the work that we've been doing goes towards. And so I wanted to focus first to set the stage on our food access study, because I think it's really interesting and it's something that maybe can be done in your communities, both like on a micro scale and sort of more on a macro scale. But we wanted to step into this space, and we didn't really know what our intervention was, right? Like the first thought in everybody's mind is, let's have a food drive, let's collect cans, let's give this boxed goods away, and that's what we think of when we think of food security. But we wanted to think about it in a much broader sense of all of us are food insecure. If the farms in our local neighborhoods reduce production capacity because of drought or rainfall, or where is the food that we are producing? Where does it go? Does it go to our local community members, or is it shipped elsewhere? Are local restaurants using those goods? Do our local farmers have the bandwidth to sustain like an economic hit of a bad year or two? Do our locals know what's grown locally? Do they know what they can eat in the wintertime? Because it's negative 30 degrees out here. Not, you can't eat tomatoes. So, what is local produce and how do you get access to it? And so the first step for us was to start a food study. And this particular study has 5 aspects to it. We're through 3 of them. There's a very comprehensive study, but I think the principles still hold sway. The first is, what is our existing, what are people's tastes? What are their preferences? What are they eating on a daily basis? What are they going to in the grocery store? What are they going to at the farmer's market? What are they currently doing? Second was talking with our local grocery stores to understand what's their buying behavior, what's driving their buying behavior. Is it that it's the cheapest thing that they can put on the shelf? Is it that it's locally grown? Is it that it's organic? Is it that it's a specific brand that they like? In a lot of cases, is it the transportation? There's a provider that drives it and drops it at their doorstep, and it's easy, and they've got an online ordering platform. And so, I'm not going to call it Smith's Farm and buy corn because it's way easier to do it online. Third was to understand what our restaurant buying behavior was, much to the same exact questions as before. What's driving this purchasing behavior? Fourth is transportation in and out of the park. How does food get from the farm to our table? Is it one large conglomerate? Is it all Cisco, and that's the only way produce gets to our doorsteps? Is it smaller? Is it smaller transportation from farmers individually? Is it I'm as a resident driving an hour and a half down to BJ's to buy what I need en masse, right? How does it get to our table? And then the last stage is going to be sort of understanding the farms and the agricultural industry around us, and how do we better connect and help sustain those farmers with our community members. What barriers are they facing on their end? So again, I know it's a really big study, but I felt like we couldn't necessarily hit on the big factors without knowing what does our food system look like. You know, where are we doing things really well, and where are we things doing very poorly. So that was one program I wanted to kind of draw attention to. And so
And I think
I
it's
guess
so pivotal, Dan, because it's also so needed for policymakers. I mean, there's a lot that relies on that kind of objective data, even though this is a lived and felt experience that the majority of people could attest to. Unfortunately, that's not always what holds sway when you're trying to garner grant support or build leverage around an issue.
100% ownership, state, federal, county. You're right.
Dan, if I could, I know this is being recorded. I actually live in Otsego County, and I'm wondering if the 5 steps, you couldn't forward that to Larry, forward to all of us, because I think it would be really useful anywhere in rural New York.
Absolutely. And I do see this as easily like the concepts to be translatable to other places. So I would more happily share that with Larry for sure.
Thank you. Thanks.
So that's one example of a kind of a holistic project, data gathering. It's not fun necessarily. It's not always sexy, for lack of a better term, but it is important. It is kind of like sets the stage for what types of programs, projects, and interventions.
Yeah, Dan, are you going to share with us some of the gleanings from that study? What were your takeaways from that? Sounds like really important information. So what are the takeaways from it?
Yeah, and I'm not sorry to hog the mic here there, Sawyer, but I'll just give the first 2 takeaways that we found is that what our perception was and what we thought was happening was not the reality. The first, in our communities, we thought that we wanted to do programmatic interventions for fixed income seniors who maybe are homebound or have problems with transportation or unable to get out of the house to drive where they needed to go, et cetera, et cetera. And what we found is that the most food insecure people in our communities were families in their mid-20s and early 30s, right? They're working a full-time job or 2 jobs. They don't have the time to take off to drive to the nearest grocery store, which may be, an hour away. They don't have the time to get their hands on a squash and cut it up and make a meal. And in a lot of cases, their overhead is more expensive. They've got student loan debt. They just bought a house. They've got expenses for their children. And so they don't have financial ability to purchase what they need. And so they're not only don't they access the food that they need, but they're cutting back and buying, unhealthy food. And that's how they're sort of like rounding the curve, which we thought was really interesting, that we needed to make sure that our programs were very inclusive of families and with small children. So we thought that was really interesting. The second thing we found interesting in our area is that we thought that the major barrier to access for a lot of our community residents was financials. The biggest thing, you go into a grocery store, what's driving your purchasing behavior is financials. It's cheaper to buy this item versus this item. And what we found is that the biggest impediment for our people was access. It's their distance from the grocery store. They don't know their farmer. It's to them, a pumpkin doesn't look like a food item. That looks like a decoration. All right. So your perceived food access, like not as it's sitting on the shelf, but when I see it sitting on the shelf, oh, that's food. I have identified that as food. I know what to do with it when it's sitting in my kitchen. And so we did find that to be interesting, is because a lot of our interventions, and to this day, a lot of our interventions are voucher programs, coupon programs, like reducing the price of produce, which is very important. And it should be a part of your sort of suite of interventions. But in a lot of our cases, that wasn't the major barrier. The major barrier was, could I get my hands on it? So those are just 2 insights that we learned that sort of informed our interventions.
And maybe this is a good segue, Dan, to talk about our collaboration, because I think that's one more tool in the toolbox for small and mid-sized communities around increasing access to food, particularly when there's not a relationship between a household and a local farm. maybe I'll back up and I'll just share our introduction to food security work, because you heard from Dan about a little bit of LivingADK's entree, although they've been doing this for a while. We first became interested in rural grocery access when the town where our office is, Keysville, lost its grocery store. And this, has happened multiple times across the park. We've lost a dozen grocery stores in 10 years. And I imagine out by you folks, you're seeing some similar phenomenons where there used to be a more local store that is now replaced by bigger stores at a distance. But it's tough around here when it's a real distance to get to them. And we were exploring some creative solutions around mixed market models. If you have a store that is selling non-food item goods, can they expand with the right equipment, freezers, cold storage, to offer a suite of fresh produce from local farms, and then be a SNAP vendor, accept double up food bucks, the traditional federal programs that help right size the costs. So we launched 3 of those, what we called pharmacies, since the first one was built into a pharmacy with a PH, and now it's a pharmacy with an F as well on the other side. And then we had the pharmacy 2, and then we have a pharmacy in Port Kent that works with Mountain Lake Services. But when the pandemic happened, we knew that we had to approach access to food from a much more immediate vantage point. And we worked with a lot of partners to do emergency food packages from our farms, delivered as a variety of different fruits, vegetables, yogurt, egg, all sorts of good stuff, plus a couple of prepared frozen meals direct to what became 1,000 households. And from there, we wanted that program to stick around once the first wave of the pandemic waned. And we've tried a couple of different tacks to see that as a more durable intervention that has 2 different arms. One is a free CSA, some of which are delivered, some of which are picked up. For those of you who don't know what a CSA is, I didn't know. It's community shared agriculture, and you pay up front to your farmers so they know how many people they're feeding, and then they plant for you, and every week you get a box of whatever is in season. The other side of the program now is what we call a fair food card. It's really just a swipeable debit card that we load funds onto every month, and they're use it or lose it funds, and they can only be spent on staple foods at our farm stores, at our local grocery stores in some places, and at our farmers markets. And that works when you have those places to spend them, but you can't swipe a card like that at most farmers markets. But when we were thinking about trying to create more access in the Old Forge area, Dan connected us to an amazing farmer, Cindy, who's an owner of Exeter Park Farm in West Winfield. And we got a whole bunch of partners together, including Naomi, Linda Wheel with the Old Forge Library, a couple of other just incredible community leaders from the faith community who could say, who in my neighborhood, who in my network would use this and needs this. And they came up with 16 names. And then there was one more name that we didn't budget for, and Cindy donated the 17th share. And I don't know if you want to talk about the distribution, Dan, because that's a feat in and of itself every week.
Yeah, I mean, I can touch base and say that it relied on the boots on the ground. Essentially, we have the person that runs the local food pantry, which is run out of St. Bart's Church. There's Nichols Church that has I want to say a satellite office, but sort of like a slightly smaller food pantry, and then the Old Forge Library, which also is a satellite food hub. And each one of those has a touch point. They know the people within their communities that needs the food, so that we don't need to know who those folks are. And they've arranged with their respective people how to get that. And in some cases, it's just teaching them, hey, you show up at this time, you ask this person, bring a bag with you, they're going to give you a bunch of produce. That's okay. It's paid for already. You're going to bring that home, you're going to cook it. And if you have any issues with cooking this, like, let me know. I'll get you some menus, but we'll go over these vegetables to kind of make the introduction to CSA a little bit easier. And I think having that friendly face that they already know, they didn't need to get to know me or Sawyer. We weren't trying to establish those relationships already. We basically handed it off to folks that already knew those people and what their needs were, which has been the first week or two. It took a little bit of getting used to, but as with anything, it smoothed itself out.
Maybe this is a good time to invite you all to share your questions or thoughts. I mean, we're a small group, so we can just chat.
I find it really interesting that the CSA connection is with West Winfield, which is a great deal closer to Otsego County than it is to Old Forge. So it'd be interesting to learn more. It's just due west, actually, of part of Presbytery of Utica on Route 20.
I think part of that,
So-
Betsy, had to do with existing relationships.
Mhm.
That happens to be a farmer that offered a CSA program. That farmer is part of the farm market already, coming up here 17 weeks out of the year. So she's in her car, she's got stuff in that car. And then she's the only farmer so far that's been willing to offer and drive every week up here, even in the winter,
Up
in the winter
to
time.
you all.
And so the decision was made in that that's a farmer willing to serve the community.
Mhm.
There's really not that many localer farms. I mean, it's still local-ish by our standards. But that was the only reason that we chose that farmer was that transportation component that we talked about. You know, we may have local,
Right.
like more local farmers, but if they're not able to get that up here in the wintertime, we might as well not have it, right? I mean,
Mhm.
do y'all see any parallels with what you're doing in your communities to something that we're doing here that we talk about?
I found it striking that as you described the survey that you did, that the folks most needing access were young families. And I suspect that would resonate in the city of Utica as well. And also, as you described food deserts, the city of Utica, if you think of where the supermarkets are, they more or less kind of ring the urban core, and the urban core itself, folks are left with convenience stores and gas stations and the like as a food source, unless they have access to transportation to make it out from the core. So, you know, it's striking to me that maybe the rural issues and the urban issues are not that far from one another.
That is such a fascinating point, Mark, and I think you're totally right. And it's in some ways like a disinvestment of, more, urban and more rural places in favor of this like very buildable, more ex-urban fringe. And it's really hard because if we're looking to profit on a grocery store and they're always assessing like, where is a constant capital base? And for us, it's hard to make the case for the big grocery store. I wonder if you all have explored the healthy bodega concept. They do it a lot in New York City, and I think they're exploring it in Albany through Capital Roots. It's another sort of version of a pharmacy, if you will, something that might be a connection.
I think we have a number of farmers markets throughout the area as well, at least in Otsego County and going south. And that's expanding more, but the kinds of things but it's still difficult to get to a farmer's market or to know the foods that really can be easy to prepare. I mean, we know what a zucchini is. We might not know what a kohlrabi or rutabaga is. And those look foreign and forget it.
And how do you cook it? And what do you
Right.
cook it with? How do you store it? I mean, we all buy Doritos at Stewart's, but not all of us know how to do those things with a kohlrabi.
Yeah.
In Utica, there is a Saturday farmers market at the train station that I frequent. And when I was there last, this past Friday, or this past Saturday rather, I noticed that I think it was Cooperative Extension had a table set up with piles of printed recipes for people to take, which I really thought was a genius idea. And I've always thought I had fairly sophisticated culinary knowledge, but I've been stumped a few times at the farmers market. There, are delicious things that I've never experienced yet.
And the farmers market in Cooperstown actually worked with the food pantry in Cooperstown and gave out little tickets, if you will, for children to choose a food item. So to begin
very
young.
cool.
Yeah.
Were you going to share something before, Edwina?
Oh, yes, I was just going to say that, your findings about the most food insecure being younger people and younger people with families. We're here in the city of Rome, and 2 days a week we have our community closet, which we give away free clothing and free housewares to individuals. We get a lot of homeless people. Some of them are families with kids. Some of them maybe just moving into apartments and starting out, and they don't have anything. And that's really kind of expanded our program. So now we've gone from handing out, clothing and housewares to having us, even though there's food pantries here, having a small emergency food pantry in our own church because people are looking for food. And as you said, one of the big needs is, produce, things that are fresh. We did have someone in our congregation who has a farm. She raises chickens. So last year we were able to give eggs to the pantries and the people that came in, and they were just so thrilled. But they had problems with some of their chickens, so we didn't have them recently. We're hoping to do that again. And now, we're having people in the congregation, if they get an excess of vegetables, we'll bring those in. Somebody else is teaching some cooking classes to show people, just the basics of things that you think everyone knows how to do, but they don't. And so, it's that old, give a man a fish he eats for a day and teach him how to fish, right? And he eats for a lifetime. And that's really what we'd like to do, is try to help people so that they can better help take care of themselves. But there's such a need, and I really appreciate the work you do and hope that we can replicate that in different areas, whether it's in rural areas or even in the cities. There's a big need for that. So thank you.
Well, we appreciate and really respect all the work you all are doing for your communities. So the feeling's mutual.
Absolutely. I mean, I wish we had a ton of time to sit down and drill down into some of these programs that y'all are doing, because I'm sure we could learn a lot from what you all have learned. I did want to bring up a second finding, which might spur more conversation as well, which was, I feel like we all get gung-ho about starting this new program and doing this new educational seminar and getting, raising these funds and buying these things. And the second phase of the study had to do with interviews of local grocery stores. And up here, we have two, like along Route 28 for about a 60-mile drive. So it was very easy to talk to the grocery stores. But I could see maybe this working in an urban setting as well. in interviewing these grocery store owners, which in both cases, they're not chains. So they're like the local grocery store, the local bodega, the local whatever. I was thinking, oh, we need to decrease access to the offerings allowed by these grocery stores. And what we found is those grocery stores didn't have a transition plan and they weren't on firm financial footing. And so here we are trying to expand our programming, and we found that the very core of our food security system was unstable. And so one of a quick-ish intervention was ANCA, which is the Adirondack North Country Association, offers a program called the Center for Business and Transition. ANCA offers CBIT, but in essence, it helps business owners to create a transition plan. What happens to your business in the event that you have a medical emergency? What happens to your business in the event that you want to retire? What happens to your business in the event that you want to step away for whatever reason? Will your son and daughter take over? Do you have an employee or a group of employees that is willing to take that over? Because the fear was that if there's no transition plan and they want to back out, what's to stop Dollar General from coming in and buying that plot of land? And now your grocery store is gone. And everything you've worked around that hub is no longer sort of accessible. So I guess the other finding I would say is, you may look at what's already working well in your communities and make sure that those are shored up, that there's no way that you can help make sure that those are stable, and don't neglect on those things that are already working well. To Sawyer's point, then the pharmacy model, when you do lose that grocery store, that's tough. That's really tough.
Or you're looking for Dollar General, which continues to expand its food section to provide the food for families.
Yeah, it's a difficult topic, right? Because is any access better than no access?
Mhm.
Probably, but it's more complicated than that. So
Yeah.
much easier just to keep your grocery store well supported. Larry, how are we doing on time? You let us know what we need to do.
Oh, we're rather flexible here. We're easy to get along with.
We love that.
One of the notions that I keep thinking about as I'm listening to you talk is simply the notion of connection. You are connecting resources together, but you're also demonstrating our connection to the land. And I think that's something that we forget a lot about. We wander into any grocery store, purchase any produce, and really don't give a lot of thought to, well, where did this actually come from? And who picked it? And how was it grown? So I think that's a real notion that we all, I just feel the need to keep that always in mind, that it's not just calories, it's connectedness, our connectedness one to another, our connectedness to the resources that we have. And you've done so many things to make us aware of things that we need to be aware of. It's very easy to throw up a food pantry, I think, but not really think about, well, who really needs the food here? And then to think about the resources that are there, and well, how sustainable are they? We just assume they're always going to be there, but that's not a valid assumption for us. So I just want to thank you for challenging it. It's too easy to look at a situation and simply infer what's going on there based on our own context and perhaps our own biases. But we need conversations like this to keep us continually challenged, to look deeper, look past. So thank you.
Indeed, I echo that. I'm on the Hunger Coalition for Otsego County, which mostly operates out of Oneonta. And what you all have done would be superb for, again, beginning with what is our urban area, Oneonta, which has about 17,000 people, residents, and an increasing number of homeless folks. And then looking likewise in the rural areas all around us.
Well, I won't speak for Dan, but my team and we'd be very happy to speak later with anybody from your community or to talk further with each of you about anything. We want to be as helpful as possible.
Thank you, because by the time you're in southern Otsego County, you're just north of the Catskills.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe the last thing I'll mention is just another area that Dan and I are partnering, and along with a lot of other organizations. It was forming a food council, which is another tool in the toolbox available to regions who want to look holistically at their food systems and try to do together what we can't really do alone. Another thing that came from the pandemic for us in the North Country was these conversations around starting the Adirondack Food Systems Network, which is a food council serving the 12 counties that touch the park. There are 15 other food councils in upstate New York, and many of them are doing really exciting things, getting off the ground. A lot of them try to support, all the different components of the food system, look for patterns, look for gaps, build convenings, build relationships, share data, issue identification and policy education. And there's a lot of that like high level stuff that, at ADK Action, we can't always get there because we want to be at the ground floor. But you all have an incredibly important perspective. And if there's a food council, you might consider seeing if there's a way to share it.
Which is great. I'm thinking also of the regional food banks, both in Albany and I guess, are you mostly associated, or how would you be with the regional food bank there or in Syracuse? We
have some food shelves that I think are in touch with distribution for the Northeastern Regional Food Bank of New York.
Okay.
It's not an area I'm super familiar with.
And we do, we are a slave to geography in that, certain food banks might affect different parts of the park, but it's really hard to create a comprehensive food map of the park in general because of just the size of it and the transportation sort of feeding networks, right? You basically have 5 thoroughfares that feed the park. You almost have 5 separate food systems where you've got the ag producer outside or just within the park, the transportation system that brings it to restaurants, grocery stores, and consumers. And then there's a point in which you basically stop because you've got another highway coming from the other side of the park, sort of on the outskirts. And Mark, living in Indian Lake, I think you can appreciate, that if you basically drive in any direction, you're 2 hours away from anything. So you're kind of right in where everything dumps off.
I can remember my parents driving to Glens Falls for kind of long-term staples. And this was the mid to late 60s. Yeah, long ways to go.
I lived in Blue Mountain Lake for 2 years, and we would drive to Warrensburg to go to Price Chopper, which was 45 minutes.
Yeah.
And even that is like the small store most people don't even like. And we're like, this is amazing. We also went to supermarkets in Utica and in Rome. So I've been in your neck of the woods looking for food.
It's striking that, I'm 66. And so this would have been when I was, well, when we left, I was going into 8th grade, so I was 13 years old. So in over 50 years, it doesn't sound to me like that part of life in the central Adirondacks, at least, has changed all that much. That people are still making those long drives to supermarkets.
I think like the last components that we didn't really touch on, but I think Sawyer might be able to fill in. I don't know, as we're improvising here, but that's theory of change. And you know, we've just touched on a couple of different programs that we implement and how we go about it. But I think really understanding your theory of change when it comes to the problem that you're working on is extremely important, because something that seems like a monolith, like food access and food security, really is so, it's, you know, a suite of like 10 different interventions. And once you start breaking down, you know, what are you actually solving for? Am I just solving for, you know, the price aspect of food access? Am I just solving for the caloric intake of food access? Am I just overcoming a transportation barrier? Am I shoring up and strengthening our existing component part of my food access? Am I teaching people to grow their own produce and their own goods, because that's going to increase your food security? Am I supporting my local ag producers, right? So each one of these has an intervention sort of to match. And I think we forget to kind of identify and be more thoughtful about like what our intervention is doing, because no one program is going to solve all of our problems. But just because it's not solving the problem over here, maybe it's not supposed to. And I think I find that to be very helpful. And you know, when tackling a large problem, it helps me from getting really overwhelmed or feeling like I'm not doing anything, or I'm not moving the needle, or like it's so big, like nobody can do anything with it. I think that does kind of help contextualize it a little bit. And I'm sure that you all have identified, you know, burnout and like all of these types of things is like part of your daily lexicon.
Yeah, I would be curious how you all find the wherewithal. I imagine faith is part of it to keep making change, even when it feels like sometimes the odds are not with you.
On many issues other than just access to food.
I think which is a concern for us, for the leadership of the Presbytery of Utica. And one of the things that we are working to get our mind around is missional identity of each of the congregations. And one of the things that we see is that each congregation has its own personality. Each congregation has its own areas where energy coalesces. So there are congregations that we see where food issues are where their energy coalesces and where that is a part of their missional identity. So what we want to do is come to terms with how best to support them in the context of their ministry, and also not to force something on someone whose missional identity is not in a given area. There are congregations that focus on immigration issues. So food touches on that, but it may not be the primary emphasis. So we need to be sensitive to what the missional identity is of each congregation and support them in that endeavor. Also be aware of the peripheral opportunities that may exist, but continue to support each congregation in the place where its identity exists. So clearly, Naomi is leading a charge in Old Forge around food issues. So that's delightful to hear. And then how do we connect those congregations that have similar missional identities? So a part of our challenge. So, but hearing what you have to say is something that amplifies our understanding of the issue. So we're really grateful to have you with us today.
I think another piece of it for us is how do we also work with our congregations to build community, because that's very different. And it seems like, I mean, a grocery store, for instance, is one place where people meet and gather. And how do we, whether it's that or a farmer's market or a bodega or anything, help people continue to work with each other and reach out to each other.
A couple of things that occur to me. One is I think that the challenge of not despising smallness. Many of our congregations are small congregations, but that doesn't mean that they can't be mighty and creative and life-giving. The other thing that occurs to me is in the Christian tradition, how often Jesus is trying to teach lessons using agricultural metaphors. Many of the parables are stories of the land, of growing, of food, and one of our two rights as Christians, although we will disagree sometimes on the theology, is to gather around a table and share a meal. It seems to me that this is at the very core of what it means, at least to be Christian, and perhaps more broadly, what it means to be human. And in somewhere in there, God's at work.
There's that connectional thing again.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I didn't, we obviously we're running out of time, but we didn't even touch on the work that Naomi is doing with the Old Forge Community Garden and with ADK Action being the fiscal sponsor of that project. So, I mean, we didn't even delve into teaching folks to grow their own food, and sort of like, so more than happy to share that aspect if anybody's looking at a community garden, a teaching garden, a classroom garden, wants to get into that, you know, million other tendrils.
We do. In the Springfield Church, which is one of our smallest congregations, has a community garden, but the members of the church also are growing vegetables that they then will donate to 3 food pantries close to where they are. But I think there are more community gardens that'd be good to have. Yeah.
There are several in Utica. The challenge in an old urban space like Utica, first of all, is to get the soil tested, because there's a long history of industrial use, heavy metals, lead paint from houses leaching into the soil. So many of the gardens are using a raised bed method, where they put a barrier between the growing medium and the soil underneath.
Hydroponics is good for that. We actually use hydroponic and grow tower systems during the wintertime. That's another sort of additional way of pulling in community gardens in the wintertime, is 6 months out of the year. But that's a new technology. It does require a new understanding of how to grow, and it's like a new technology. So, you know, even though a grow tower may be easy to access, about $100, which is a lot of money for some folks, for other folks it may not be so much. That is an idea to throw at you if growing in the wintertime And we do have a school down the road that is defunct, that is now an indoor growing space that started as a cure for seasonal affective disorder and sort of the scourge of suicide that we have in our communities, to provide places of greenery and UV lighting and hope in the dead of winter time. So obviously food and growing of food serves many functions, which I know I'm not telling you stuff you don't already know,
But that's a really cool use of school buildings also. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Well, it's our custom to end with a blessing. So Dan, Sawyer, thank you for being with us. Oh, this is a prayer from the Chinook Psalter. May we be touched by grace, fascinated and moved by this, your creation, energized by the power of new growth at work in your world. May we move beyond viewing this life only through a frame, but touch it and be touched by it, know it and be known by it, love it and be loved by it. May our bodies, our minds, our spirits learn a new rhythm paced by the rhythmic pulse of the whole created order. May spring come to us, be in us, recreate life in us. May we forge a new friendship with the natural world, discover a new affinity with beauty, with life, and with the cosmic Christ in whom all things were created in heaven and earth, visible or invisible, whether thrones or dominions or principalities or authorities. For all things were created in that way. In his name, amen.
Amen.
All right, friends, thank you. The Lord be with
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you all very much
Nice to
again
meet
for
each of you.
being here.
Bye now.
Thanks,
Bye.
everybody.